My name is Jose Bohorquez, and I've got Rob Packard here with me. And as Sean said, we're going to be talking about FDA software documentation and then IEC 62304. Quick intro on the agenda. So I'll give you just quick background on Rob and on myself so you understand who we are. We'll go into eSTAR, some of the standards that are applicable for medical device software, and then some of the guidance documents that FDA has. We're not going to go into them all in detail. We're really just going to focus on one standard, 62304, and one guidance document, which is the one that relates to software and eSTAR. We'll talk about IEC 62304, and then we'll talk about just that mapping between those references, the process that you follow, and then the artifacts or attachments that come out of it. That is what your regulatory leader or consultant is going to want from you to upload into eSTAR so they can submit your 510K. And then we'll end with just a quick intro into Rob's company, Medical Device Academy. If you don't follow him on YouTube and LinkedIn and all those places, you absolutely should. Rob puts out some of the best content out there to help on a variety of topics. And then I'll tell you about BoldType and CyberMed, which are the two companies that I head up. All right, cool. So my background, Jose Bohorquez, I'm president of BoldType. BoldType does software development for medical devices, and then CyberMed, which does cybersecurity consulting. I have a PhD in electrical engineering and computer science. Been in the medical device space for about 20 years, and I'm part of the Association for Advancement of Medical Instrumentation, the software working group, and the security working group. And also, about once or twice a year, I participate in NIH SBA or review panels. Startups are very near and dear to my heart, and I know Rob, the same is true. And Rob, maybe if you can give some background on yourself.
Yeah, I actually started my own medical device company, a laparoscopic imaging system company, back in 2004, and very heavy in software abuse. We were reprocessing video images from red, green, and blue stills into full frame video, and then doing intervention in between, zoom, playing with the lighting so we didn't have any dull, dim spots on the screen, whereas usually laparoscopy, you have this bright center and dark corners. So we did all the kinds of stuff you can do on your cell phone now for nothing, but laparoscopic imaging systems didn't do that in 2004. Camera phones didn't do that in 2004. So after I had started that company, I learned the hard way, because my regulatory consultant died of pneumonia, that maybe this was very strategic to learn a little bit about regulatory, and I needed to know a little bit more about the pathway and what documentation was needed. So I didn't know anything about quality or regulatory at the end of 2004 going into 2005. And that's when I started learning it. And a year later, I was director of quality and regulatory affairs for a medical device company. And I've been there multiple times for multiple startup companies. So it's always been startup companies that I've been joining with. And 3 of those have sold and been very successful. 2 of them went public. And now all I do is just help startup companies get their product to market. So the biggest hurdle for them is, how do I do all this paperwork for quality and regulatory? And so that's my goal, is to help 100 companies a year for the next 20 years to get 2,000 products to market.
That's amazing. Yeah, and I think we share that passion for startups. I also grew up in the startup world, having either worked or led startups in the earlier part of my career. And I think it's the funnest place to be, because that's where a lot of the innovation is happening and things move a lot faster, and you're trying to move fast and not break things, right? So that's where I think both
A
Rob's
little breaking's okay.
a little breaking is okay, especially if you've got a good recovery plan, but hopefully nothing that's going to hurt anyone. eSTAR form, Rob, I think your email has the word FDA eSTAR in it. So you're like, I would
Do you
say,
think I might be
expert
able to
on
say
this.
something about it?
Yeah. I'd love to get your thoughts on eSTAR when it came about. Like, what do you think about it in general? And then maybe we can talk about, when your medical device has software, what does that mean from an eSTAR standpoint?
Just so people know some of the basics, it's a PDF form. It's a protected PDF form that you cannot manipulate and change the way it works. You have to have Adobe Acrobat Pro to make it work. There are a couple other software tools that they try to make work with it, but they're always fixing the bugs because it doesn't work with those other ones well. Do not do that. Don't use somebody else's cheaper software. Spend the 20 bucks a month to get Adobe Acrobat Pro until your project's done. Honestly, for the amount of rework I had to do with a couple of clients, I would pay you $20 to get Adobe Acrobat Pro. At least one person in your company. But the eSTAR stands for Electronic Submissions Template and Resources. On the left-hand side is where they have the little blue add attachments. That's where you attach your documents. If there's a red line next to it, it's not optional. If there's a gray line next to it, and you notice none of the software section is gray, if you have software and you want to try to avoid a piece of documentation that's on that list, you can't. It won't be allowed to submit. You won't even be able to upload it because they validated it so you can't. Pretty smart technique. So it eliminates the need for a checklist. And then on the right-hand side, they have these little help buttons that are little blue buttons with a question mark. That's, I don't know what the hell that is. You just click on that question mark button and it tells you what it is. And the one at the very top gives you 3 guidance documents for software. So if you, I think it's 3, but all the guidance documents are in that section. You just click on the help button and it gives you a hyperlink and you can download it and read it. And then each of the individual items will have additional comments that are probably copied and pasted again from the guidance. But if you have one document for all your software documentation, that's going to be a nightmare for you because you're going to have to split it up into all these different ones. And to answer your question about do I like it or what do I think about it, I mastered the old system. And so you think of, I don't want to change. I don't want to change. Nobody likes change. I had all my templates working perfectly. Everything was running smoothly. I said, okay, guys, as soon as this is available as an eSTAR, we've got to tackle this and learn it because it's going to be so painful to learn. And the first one we did took just as long, if not a little bit faster than a normal one. The second one took me half the time. And every single one has gotten faster since. So if you're doing an FDA eSTAR and you're not hiring a regulatory consultant, it will probably take you the same amount of time as it would have taken to do it the old way. But you probably won't have to look up the directions as much because they're on the form. Yeah. For me, hands down, this is so much faster than the old way. And now that everybody has to do it the same way, the FDA doesn't have to play referee. Well, this company has to do it this way, but it's not so important for this. But everybody has to do it the same way. Everybody has to use the same form, the template, and everything in terms of what has to be attached is right there. So I love that part about it. There are not, it's not perfect, but nothing ever was. It's a continuous
I kind
improvement.
of put almost like paint by number. And you made the point, like, even if you've got a regulatory consultant, which frankly, if you're a startup, I 100% think you should have a regulatory consultant who does this all the time. So they've seen everything. So just call Rob if you need somebody. Even if that's the case, I think entrepreneurs should still download this form and just kind of look through it, because the first time you look at this form should not be as you approach submission. It should be like as you're starting your project, so you understand what FDA is looking for. As you mentioned, Rob, this shows you the guidance documents that you should be looking at. When you click on those question marks, the text in there is almost verbatim, or usually verbatim from the guidance documents. There's lots of guidance documents. There's a few that you absolutely have to read. And I do think it's a good idea. The other kind of interesting thing about the eSTAR form is that at the beginning, there's some check marks and selections you make. That's one of the things that catches people off guard. We're not talking cybersecurity today, but once you check that your medical device has software, it's like, boom, the 12 cybersecurity attachments come up. So you understand that FDA is going to be expecting those too. So between software and cybersecurity, there's about 24 different attachments associated with that. There's 22, but then interoperability comes into play, and then there's labeling. So there's lots to it, and it's a great idea to look through it. The other interesting thing about the fact that it's interactive is that you can see what shows up here is 10 different documents, but this drop down is where you select whether your software is basic or enhanced. And if you're basic, one of these goes away, which is the software design specifications. So the form in general is interactive like that. But what I thought we would do is, you made another really good point, Rob, and I think it ties into the main story of today's webinar, which is that we always advise people, try to build your SOPs in your process so that the output matches like the attachments for the form. Because like you said, we've seen this where we kind of have a single document that has our architecture and our software design specification. It's just break it up into two and change your process so you naturally have two documents. Or yeah, so just do things, make it as easy as possible for the reviewer to know exactly like what to expect in that document, and your review process will go a lot smoother.
There was a question in the Q&A. So if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A. We'll both be monitoring that. But this one is an easy one. Is there an updated form available for the QMSR? And the answer is no, because the 510K submissions are not about your quality system. They're about the V&V testing for your device. So the only place that it would really relate to quality system as it relates to software is right above, I'm sorry, right below the software design specification that Jose was showing. Right below that, it says software lifecycle processes, management, maintenance. That's where you're going to put in procedures. If you look in the QMSR, it doesn't really say anything about software in there other than go see ISO 1345 2016. And if you read ISO 1345 2016, it doesn't say anything about design of software. It talks about validation of quality system software. It talks about validation of calibration software. It talks about equipment like sterilizers, that equipment being automated, validating that. It does not talk about 62304 other than no, go see 62304. So you don't have, there's no updated one. There is a version 6.0 that came out October 1st. So you have to be aware that they do update this periodically, and people, I can guarantee it will be updated in the middle of your project at least once. There's an export import button at the bottom of the form that's pretty easy. And if you don't know the shortcuts on how to get all your attachments over, call me up and I'll show you. It's the best half hour ever you spent. You have some attachments in there, you need to upgrade to 6.0. I'll show you in a heartbeat how to do it.
Perfect. Good. All right, cool. So moving on from here, I debated whether to include this diagram because the idea is not to freak people out, but there is a lot of stuff that you should be aware of and you should read, or somebody on your team should know, and it can be your extended team. What I'm showing here on the left in pink is a variety of standards that are particularly important if your medical device has software. As Rob just mentioned, ISO 1345 for quality management systems, 14971 for risk, and then 62304 is like the main software focused standard, but 62366 around usability is also relevant, right? Your medical device has to be usable, the software has to be usable. And then SW96 is the new kid on the block. It's related to cybersecurity. It's the successor to a couple of TIRs, 57 and 97. And then there's a variety of other ones. 8002-1 is really, I find it very helpful, right? It's showing you how to apply 14971 to software because they're similar, but it's not the same process. So that's a good one. And then FDA has a lot of guidance documents. This one here, the content of pre-market submissions for device software functions, is a really critical one. It's a one that explains to you what goes into the eSTAR form. Lots of other ones around off-the-shelf software, around, of course, the cybersecurity ones. This one for validations, 20 years old, but it's still important and active. So lots to be familiar with. Rob, I don't know, any tips that you give clients as they try to navigate all of this?
You had a really good point earlier. Don't wait for the very end of the process to look at the eSTAR. Same thing is true for all these standards. That's all this entire slide is what design inputs is all about. You need to understand these standards and their impact on your device. Some of these don't apply to your product. I don't know of any product that has all of these. And also, even if you have one that applies, not all the clauses in it apply. For example, if you have a Class B device, all the parts of 62304 related to Class C devices do not apply to you. So you need to read each one and understand whether it applies to you or not. And if you feel overwhelmed when you see a list this long, that makes sense because you probably can't develop an entire product all by yourself. You probably have a design team that does that. And you might even have some suppliers carrying some heavy loads for you too. You might have somebody doing cybersecurity, somebody doing software documentation, maybe somebody's doing the mobile app and you're doing the web-based. So you divide and conquer. And that's exactly what you should do with this very long list of standards is divide and conquer. But it would be at the design input stage of your design process. Not that I'm telling everybody to use the waterfall process, because I'm not. I'm just saying when you have a list of approved inputs at the end of the day, that list of inputs should include most of this list.
Yep. Good. All right, cool. So now if we get it into 62304 itself, we are talking about this with Rob earlier, that some people, like, it's almost like they're nervous or scared to look at 62304. And the part of the standard that's really relevant is maybe 20 pages long. And really the main portion of it, which is clause number 5, is literally 10 pages long, right? So there's like the software development process. If you look, it starts on page 22 and ends on page 32, 10 pages. And then you should read through the risk management process, but that one is only 3 pages long, right? So it's not so long. Now, it's good for somebody on your team to understand all of it, because it's not software configuration management. Doesn't matter. It does matter. And it's part of what you're telling FDA about. But most of the people on your team who are touching software should spend the 20, 30 minutes it takes to read at least through those 10 to 15 pages and get a sense of what 62304 is trying to talk about. And like, I'm going to skip through some of this thing and just get to the punchline here. 62304 is about process. And the general principle is that if you follow a good process, it's more likely to end up in good software and a good medical device than if you're sloppy about it and you're just doing it haphazardly. But Rob, would love to get your thoughts on like how you think about 62304 and how you help people with that.
For 62304, I really like giving people tools in that info diagram that you had, where you had 5.1, 5.2, 5.3. You went through all the sections of 5, and then you just had an arrow that went across and said, here's all the requirements for attaching in the 510K. Understanding that those are almost one for one is really helpful. And people have said to me, but it's this iterative loop. How can you do that one for one? And because you revise the documents, just like you revise your software. So I asked a question to Jose earlier when we were in the practice session at the beginning, and I was like, Jose, do you approve the documents at the end, or do you approve them, not approve them and have them as drafts unapproved, and then edit them that way? So it was like, how do you do the approvals of these documents? And he and I have seen different ways to do it, but it's really important to think about. You have these 5.1 through 5.8 requirements of 62304. That tells you how you develop software and how you document it. And there are shalls, and the FDA requires that you say you actually follow that. And then over on the other side, for the documentation, they're asking you for the end result. Please attach it.
Yeah, we'll touch
So
on that a little bit too, on just like how those two end up mapping. Something also that trips people up is they're used to hearing that their medical device is either class 1, class 2, or class 3. And all of a sudden they get to 62304 and they see that their software is either class A, class B, or class C. And then they go to fill out their eSTAR form. They say the software is basic or enhanced. So I'd say the simple one, just forget class 1, class 2, class 3. There's not a one-to-one mapping. Obviously, there's correlation. If you're a class 3 medical device with software, it's more likely that you're going to be class C, but it's not a one-to-one mapping. The big question, and we'll look at the flow chart next, but is if the software could fail and no damage, no harm, no injury is going to happen to somebody, then you're class A. In our experience, it's quite rare. I would say that the majority of software falls into class B, and very little falls into class A, and then like some proportion into class B. And I know, Rob, you've got maybe some historical statistics on that, at least in your experience. Class B is you could cause injury if there's a failure in the software, but it's non-serious. And then class C is death or serious injury could be possible if the software fails. And we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. But just as a frame of reference, understand that's the classification. And as Rob mentioned earlier, that classification maps to subclauses that either are or are not applicable to your specific device. We'll look at that in a minute, but that's the gist of it. Okay, cool. So, yeah.
For the 62304 classifications, I would say it's maybe less than 10% of products that go to the FDA are Class A. No matter how much you say it's Class A, the FDA is pretty much not regulating Class As. They might have them as a Class 1 510K exempt, but if they're reviewing it as a 510K, it's probably not a Class A. Just a rule of thumb.
No, that's great.
Less than 10%, single digit numbers. The Class C, that's not the case. There are a lot of products out there that the FDA definitely thinks are Class C. You and I might not agree, Jose, but the FDA wins on a lot of these. They're saying they're Class Cs, and they're even worse on the enhanced. So, as Jose said, we have ABC, and then we have basic and enhanced. The enhanced, they are more likely to say it's enhanced than you or I are. They're conservative. They're bureaucrats. They don't want to make, when in doubt, go tougher.
Yeah.
So I would say there are definitely more C's than there are A's, but B is definitely the fat meat middle. And there is definitely more basic out there than I think there is enhanced, but it's not an 80-20 split. It's more like a 60-40 split. So I would say there's 60% basic and 40% enhanced. And I think companies, a lot of times, just by not doing a really good job of architecture and risk controls, make the FDA really nervous and push themselves to enhance sometimes.
That's good thing to keep in mind. If you're in doubt, if it's on the edge, you're probably better off treating it as enhanced. We'll talk about what those differences are, and it's not like it's the end of the world, but you're definitely going to be more rigorous and comprehensive. There's a spreadsheet that we made internally for our team. I'm happy to share it with you. Just if you want a copy of it, just comment spreadsheet in the comments and we'll email it to you. But when we're looking at eSTAR versus 62304 and the classification, as Rob alluded to this differently, as you go through that standard, there's going to be little brackets that'll say A comma B comma C, or just B and C. Actually, if it includes, they'll include C, right? C, you require everything. Fewer number require B and fewer number require A. So as an example, something like software development standards, methods, and tools, that's only required if you're Class C. Something like the different types of testing, for example, might be required for different ones. So your software supporting items to be controlled, having that documented is only required if you've got Class B or Class C. So you'll look through that and you'll see that the higher the classification, the more of the clauses that apply to you. But as Rob mentioned, like one of the things you can do through here is go, hey, we know we're Class B. Okay, filter out all the Class C stuff. You don't necessarily need to worry about that. Sometimes it's a good practice anyway. There's products that we develop, as an example, unit testing, right? Unit testing is not required if you're Class A or Class B even, but it is for Class C, and it is for an enhanced documentation for FDA. You have to actually submit the unit testing results. Like you're not just providing a summary. So being aware of that early so that you incorporate unit testing into your system is really important. You don't want to get to the end of your development process and then realize that FDA is going to ask for all your unit test documentation and you didn't do a unit testing. You're not going to get the benefit of it. It's beneficial to do it, and it's going to be a lot more work. But I don't know, Rob, anything else that comes to mind?
Didn't have anything else. We had a couple of questions here I was trying to answer.
Okay, cool.
There was a really good one in there about the new version of 62304.
Oh, yes.
I know you personally are very up to date on that. I made the comment, they were asking if the eSTAR is likely to change and the process is likely to change with the new standard. And I would say absolutely yes. But at the same time, I'd also absolutely say that it's not going to happen in 26 because the FDA takes 6 to 12 months to recognize the standard to start with. And we don't know how it will impact it yet.
Yeah. And one of the things that happens in the next version, that what's expected is there's also going to just be 2 classifications. But from what I've seen, it's not a match of basic and enhanced versus the 2 classifications that will be in the new version of 62304. It's almost like the mapping right now is pretty close. I think that's one of the upcoming slides. It's pretty close to Class C is definitely enhanced, And then class B is like maybe 20% or 30% of products that are class B would still be considered enhanced. That would be my estimate, Rob. I don't know if you've got a different one, but
I think that's probably true. What I really wish they would do is come up with a little bit better guidance at the FDA on how to migrate from what the standard says to what they're using, or just marry themselves to what the standard says. And it seems like this is an opportunity, but doesn't mean they'll agree with the new standard.
yeah, good point. Yeah, the verdict is out because it's not out yet, but I can tell you that it's not going to be a perfect match either. You have to perform the analysis from FDA standpoint when it comes to enhanced versus basic. And as Rob has been saying, you want to do it early in the process because you don't want to then have to go back and retrofit your design history file. From a process standpoint, this is a high level view of the process. This is figure 1 of 62304. They're saying, look, we don't regulate, like this is not directly relevant to 62304. It's not what 62304 is about. It's not about customer needs or the system architecture, but that feeds into the software development process. And a couple of things to note. One of them is that software risk management is seen across the entire life cycle of product development. It's a point that they make here. It's also a point that's made in 8002, where it says, look, this isn't an exercise you do once. As you go through the development process, you're going to realize that there's new risks that arise, maybe because you made a certain design decision or during your testing, you realize there's a new thing. So risk management really traverses the entire process. And then there's an implication that this is a waterfall model, right? You do first the planning, then the requirements analysis, then the architecture design, then the detailed design, then unit implementation, integration, system testing, software release. But there is allowance for having a more agile approach in this. And there's a good standard technical report around that to look at. But you can, if you're going to do in sprints, for example, then for any given sprint, you might want to say, okay, what impact does that have on the architecture? What is the design of the thing that we're going to build in this sprint? And then you build it and then you test it and then you go to the next one. So there's still this idea that you should have requirements, architecture, design, implementation, test. And then the other two things that are true along the whole cycle are configuration management and then software problem resolution. That's just something that's happening along the entire software development process. So it's all about process, all about these are things you should be doing. And of course, artifacts are dropping out of this.
There was a couple of things in the chat, but before I get to those, I wanted to say this is always going to be iterative. And with software, it's one of the few areas because the cost of verification validation is not nearly as expensive usually as something like electrical safety testing. You can usually test something out on a prototype and go through the whole testing plan and have it fail and go back and make corrections or modifications. You can't necessarily afford to do that when you're spending $100,000 at electrical safety labs, but you can guarantee that your product owner is going to add a feature at some point because you had customer feedback at one of your reviews that said, oh, it would be really cool if it had this feature. And everybody's, oh, yeah, you're right. We got to add that. And, or you realize the software doesn't really work the way you wanted to without that feature. Or, whoops, we didn't read the cybersecurity section where it says we have to have these 8 controls. So all 3 of those examples, you have to go back and add requirements. And now you have new SRS, you have new SDS, and you're doing a lot more work. So it's always going to be iterative. I would say that the same is true of hardware, but people deny that and say it's not true. And then I see them make edits to their design and make new prototypes. So I think it always happens in all design is a hybrid model of iterative and phase gate, but software especially, you're going to always have people adding stuff on. The comments I was going to make about what's in the chat, somebody said, or a couple of people said, please send me the spreadsheet. Put the spreadsheet requests in the chat, correct, Sean?
Yeah, we should be able to find them in both places, but
Okay, we have both places. And I really think that this particular slide is really helpful to people to see that the process, what comes first, what comes second, what comes third. But if they understand it's iterative, that's the key piece of understanding is yes, it's linear, but at the same time, you're going to have to go back and fix things and try again.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think and again, and somebody put this in the chat. Thank you. I was blanking out on the number. TIR 45 is all about agile. So thanks to Rama about you incorporating agile into 62304. You can have sprints, right? It's just within those sprints, you shouldn't be designing something if you don't have requirements around it. So you're going to want to, within the sprints, like what are the requirements of the thing we're building? Because how are you going to test that the thing you built works if you don't have requirements to test against? So it's this notion of you're going to have
definition of done.
Yeah, exactly. What's the definition of done if you don't have requirements? And during testing, as you said, you might discover, hey, there's like a change that we need to make that we're finding because of that. That's okay. So the next sprint, you just update the requirement. One of the sort of tips that we were discussing with Rob earlier is you want to make your approval process really as easy as possible. You probably don't want to have 12 people signing off on an architecture document. You don't want to have very cumbersome processes because then people just will try to skip them. You're much better off saying, let's have these as living documents that can be easily uprevved. So we've got a snapshot of what was the architecture that we designed these features around and we did this testing around. It's not to say that it's the only way to do it, but I know on our end and when we're doing software development, what we try to do is we try to put together a preliminary version of requirements early, sign off on it, go, we know these things have to be made. So as we start building some of the features, we're building them against requirements. Put together your preliminary architecture document, sign off on it, and then just get over that sense that once it's signed, it's set in stone. It is not. Like it's just one revision. Just if you need to change it, just upright it. Should be easy.
I think this would be a good place for me to mention or explain what value-added auditing of software is. A non-value-added auditor says your procedure says this, you didn't do it. Or this standard says this, you didn't do it. Or worse, they come up with their own opinions and force them on you and say, this is the best practice and you didn't do it that way, and here's your nonconformity. Those add absolutely no value. What adds value is when you're doing an internal audit or a supplier audit, and you go in and look at the way they're doing their documentation, say, how long did it take you to get from here to here? And like, something's wrong. And like, why haven't you signed off on this document yet? Or why don't you have this documented yet? And you start to understand how their process is, and you realize either they're approving things too early, they're approving them too late, they've got too rigorous of a process for review and approval of something they're going to change multiple times. So you have to make your processes streamlined and easy to update and revise, just like you've done your code. You have configuration management and version control of software. You have to have a quality system that works the same way. It's absolutely essential for software developers to have a robust, streamlined, I emphasize, process for software documentation where you create the documents because you know you need that, and you make it easy to revise and approve so it evolves with your software. And there are several different ways to do that, and a good value-added audit can help see where you're inefficient and slow or completely not meeting a requirement and give you advice, because they're an internal auditor or a second party auditor doing a supplier audit of a software party and not a third party certification body that isn't allowed to give you advice. And if you're not sure how to do that, a couple options. One is hire an outside firm that does a good job of that. And we have a couple of people that do that. But if you want to learn how to do that, if you want to have somebody on your team that does auditing, learn how to do that, we have a course that we're launching in December. And if you want to be on the wait list, just type it in the comments or the chat here, wait list, and we'll get you on the wait list. And you can take that course, and you can take it as many times as you want as new standards come out. Like 62304, the new version, we're going to have updates to the course, and all those are free. So you buy it once, you get all the updates for free.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's great knowledge to have. I know you spent part of your career as an auditor yourself, and I'm sure that was hugely valuable to now helping people put these things together. That's something I tell people all the time too. Is there's startups, right? We mostly deal with startups. So when I say people, I'm mostly talking about startups. We tend to focus on getting FDA clearance, but that's one time you're going to interface with the FDA. Another time you're going to interface with them is when they come knocking and audit your SOPs and your facility and everything else like that. So it's not like we're cleared, we're good. There's still going to be, there's things that you don't submit to FDA during your 510(k) submission that you still are responsible for doing. And so making sure that you keep your design history file and your quality management system in good shape is critical for long-term success. It can be too short-sighted. All right, we got 15 minutes, so I'm gonna move on here real quick. I saw that there was a question earlier, and I wanted to touch on it. When you're going through 62304, that this is the decision tree for that, right? It's you start off, and you're starting off with the assumption you're Class C, right? So as Rob mentioned earlier, from a regulatory standpoint, you always kind of want to be a little conservative. So you start, you go, okay, Class, you're probably not going to be, but start with that assumption, and then you ask, can a hazardous situation arise from a failure in the software? And one important thing to note here is that this isn't, is it likely to, like, what's the likelihood that it could result in this? It's, is it possible that a software failure could result in a hazardous situation? And then if it is, then you evaluate the effectiveness of risk control measures external to the software. So it can't be like, oh, we're going to add this routine in the software. There's this part of the software that protects it. It has to be outside of that software. And then you ask yourself, does the failure of the software result in unacceptable risk? And then what's the severity of the risk? And that's what's going to tell you, is it Class A, Class B, or Class C? And in determining this, you assume that the software is going to fail. It's not your 14971 risk management where you've got probabilities of whether or not it's going to happen. FDA is telling you, assume the software is going to fail. Okay, what's the worst case harm that's going to come from that failure? So that's the 62304 lens. From an FDA standpoint, it's a little bit different. They're saying enhanced documentation should be provided for any pre-market submission that includes software device functions where failure or flaw of any device software function could present a hazardous situation with probable risk of death or serious injury. So it's pretty similar, right? But it's more tied to class. That's what we're saying. We're like captures all of Class C and a part of Class B. Rob, I don't know, you see a lot of these, and I know you mentioned earlier.
I actually have a good way to handle that. I use as a rule of thumb. I use it for risk management in 14971, and then I use it also for software. And it answers one of the questions that was in here. And I hope I answer your question, so I'm going to answer, say, quick answer live, but hopefully I'm answering. If not, go ahead and clarify what you want to know. But I say use a 5-point scale because that's what the FDA is most used to. And if you have a 10-point scale, you spend a whole bunch of wasted time arguing over whether it's a 5 or a 6. The smaller the scale, the less arguing it goes on. And then I say 3s, 4s, and 5s could be reportable. 1s and 2s are not. And reportable events are something that could result in a serious injury. So if you're saying it's a 3, then you're saying it's a serious injury. Some people don't like that scale, but I find that a lot of things that people want to say are 2s, the FDA says is a 3. And a lot of things people say that's not a serious injury, the FDA disagrees. So I tend to go with 3 is a serious injury, 4 is a permanent disability, and 5 is death. And usually people get that pretty well. The serious injury, permanent disability, death. Could it happen? And it's not just directly from your device that's software, it's from the hazardous situation that results from it. And if you're looking for examples, the best place to look is not 14971 because that was not written for software at all. It says that it applies to software, but then they have a separate guidance document that's actually helpful. So go to the 80002-1 standard. It's IEC TR 80002-1. Go there, and Jose's pulling it up. And I think he had it mentioned in his slides. Pull that up. That's really helpful. And it has 6 pages of examples of hazards in there. So go there and it will really help you master how to document risk and hazards for software, because 14971 really doesn't do it justice for software.
And in fact, like the parallel advice is in the FDA guidance document, this contents of pre-market, one of the last appendices, like towards the end, it's documentation level examples. This is almost like a fun game you can play with a couple of people on your team. Oh, sorry, where it gives you a bunch of examples and then tells you the outcome. So like a non-invasive blood pressure monitor with inflatable cuff gives you a description, gives you a rationale, and it says the outcome, basic documentation level. And it's got a couple dozen of these where it has both enhanced and basic. So that's a really good way of, I'm really glad they did this because it's one of the hardest things to go, what about this? What about that? This gives you a lot of examples. It's not foolproof. Your device probably is not going to fit exactly into one of these, but at least it gives you a better sense of what their expectations are. All right, I gotta lose my slides now. Where'd they go? Give me 1 second. All right. Okay, cool. 10 minutes left. Okay, so here's how we recommend having this relationship between these standards. So let me orient you through the slide. So you've got these various standards, 62304, 14971, et cetera. You've got all these various software guidance documents. You've got a couple of cybersecurity guidance documents. As you're building your SOPs or working with a consultant, ideally, they're built to meet the needs or the requirements or the processes that are dictated in these standards and guidance documents. And what they're for is to guide that software development process and cybersecurity process so that at the end, you have these 9 or 10 software attachments and these 12 to 14 cybersecurity attachments. And really, at the heart of this is these SOPs. And you want to start with both the beginning and the end in mind. So the beginning being these standards and guidance documents, and of course the regulation. And then the end being like, what are the deliverables going to be to FDA during the submission? And make sure that your SOPs are designed to meet both needs. So that as you're going through the process, these documents that are dropping off of the process, you don't have to at the end massage them all to match what FDA is looking for. Just to give you a real quick example, this is part of our SOPs internally for software development at BoldType. And as in the software development process, you'd be starting. So this is not the entire process because there's a planning phase that starts before this. But once you get into development, you do your software requirements analysis. That's a process. That's a thing you're doing. The output would be your software requirement specifications and your SRS verification. Because by the way, in 62304, you're not just verifying the end product. There's like verification of documents. So like you're verifying, for example, that your architecture lines up with your requirements. So when then you do your software architecture design, and that output would be your software architecture document itself and the verification that it meets the requirements or it's going to. Then the software detail design, if it's applicable for you, that's a process and a result. And here's one of the, I think, key important insights. The reason 62304 exists is because industry recognized that if you just start writing code, you're not going to end up with good software. That good software comes from a process where you take time to really understand the requirements, take time to architect the whole system, take time to think through how you're going to design each of these units and subsystems, and then start coding. Their objective, and FDA says this in the guidance document, is that no developer should ever like just sit down to code, making a bunch of design decisions as they're coding. There should be a design in place that they're following where by the time they're writing code, it's almost paint by numbers. Like they've already thought through how different functions are going to work, how they're going to tie together, how they're going to integrate together, what unit testing they might have to do. And so you're following that process. And if you structure it correctly, again, these outputs of these processes will be ready to go into the eSTAR form at the end of it.
I had a quick question for you about your procedures. Do you have your CAPA process integrated incident responses, or are those two separate processes?
That's a good question. I haven't looked at that in a little bit, but I think we've got the CAPA process as separate, but it's linked through the software problem resolution process. But how do you typically recommend clients do that?
Some clients really want to minimize the number of procedures and consolidate things. And when cybersecurity documentation from the FDA got added on in 2023, we found a lot of companies coming to us say, we need procedures for this. And the first part was the stuff for their 510K, and that's 12 documents. But then afterwards, some companies actually have cybersecurity incidents. That really does happen. It's not a myth. And so when you have cybersecurity incidents, you have to have an incident response plan. And they're like deer in the headlight. What do I do? I'm like, this should not be your first fire drill. You should have figured this out beforehand. And so I hope most of them have a decent CAPA process. And I've often thought maybe for the people that really have not had to tackle an incident response before, and I know you have, but a lot of people with a startup company, maybe they've never done it before. So tackle it like you would a CAPA. Like, we have this problem. What are we going to do to investigate to figure out what the root cause is? Oh, we need to contain it first. Let's contain it. And then we got to recover. That's part of the containment. Like, we got to get the customer back on their feet with the software and recover their system.
Yeah, we found that it's like in our case, we tend to include that in the cybersecurity management plan because SOPs tend for the whole company. And if you're doing multiple projects, they're incorporated into it. So what we'll have in the SOPs is, hey, you need to make sure that you've got a cybersecurity risk management plan or cybersecurity management plan, and that it includes these various elements of it. But the thing that you would do, the game plan, if an incident happens, is not in an SOP, it's in the plan because it's specific to your particular, to this product. Right? It's going to be very nuanced depending on the components and the architecture and the risk level of that specific product, et cetera. So what we put in the SOPs is here's what you'll want to include, and then what you're going to do is more in the plan itself.
That's a really great idea. I like it.
Yeah, it's a good way to. Okay, cool. I think this is almost the last slide. This is the pièce de résistance of like how they map, and it's not a perfect mapping. And there's a couple little notes here. 62304, you've got this software development planning process. And then one of the deliverables is this software lifecycle process description. And it's a longer thing. One of the things you can do is actually have a declaration of conformity to the FDA recognized version of 62304. So that's one of the benefits of your company having SOPs that are designed around 62304 and following that process. If you do, you can declare that conformity, and you have to provide all of that. With everything else, you do provide the outputs, but your software requirement specification, that's an easy one. That one comes right out of your software requirements analysis. Your system and software architecture design chart would come right out of your software architecture design process. Your software firmware description is not really something that 62304 calls for, but if you've got a good architecture document, and the requirements for 62304 for your architecture process are a bit more in depth than actually what FDA calls for. So you should have enough detail in that where you can fairly easily come up with that description. The analysis of software contributing to hazardous situation, again, that's that clause 7, 62304 would be part of, but it's not going to be sufficient for your risk management file. And then it'll feed into your documentation level evaluation. This is not something that 62304 directly would guide you to because they view it differently. But the analysis that you do as part of that software classification of ABC will be helpful as you then make the determination around the documentation level. Software detail design, again, like that maps directly if you're enhanced, which is typically Class C, but as Rob has said, not always. And then your software unit implementation and verification, your integration and integration testing, and your software system testing, those are combined into a single kind of thing you deliver, which is the software testing as part of verification and validation. And what we do is we provide both the protocols and the results. If you're basic, you only need to provide a summary of unit testing if you needed to do unit testing. If you're enhanced, you actually need to provide like a much more comprehensive, the actual results and like an explanation of all the results when they were executed, that kind of thing. And then lastly, your software release, which is part of 62304, some of that would feed into your software version and revision history. And this unresolved software anomalies, this might be part of your package of your software release process. Of course, it's also going to be fed by each of the different types of testing that you did. So I've got a whole article actually I got an article on this on our CyberMed website that you guys can check out. But here, as we wrap up real quick, I know you're probably coming on, Sean, to tell me we got to wrap it up. Rob, quick thing you want to say about Medical Device Academy and what you guys do and how people can find you?
Yeah, the medicaldeviceacademy.com is the website, all one word. We have a very large website. So there's 150 different pages, then another 250 posts. We have a YouTube channel with almost 700 free videos you can watch. And in December, as I said earlier, we have a lead auditor course that you can take. It's on demand at your own pace. Take it from home, and you can take it as many times as you want, including refreshers next year, the year after. You only pay once. If you want to be on the wait list, just type wait list in the comments, and we'll hook you up with this is when it's available. But it's going to be December 1st is the pre-orders, and then it goes live December 19th.
Awesome. And then on my end, as I mentioned earlier, I run a company called Boldtype. We do medical device electronics and software, all medical devices. I do host like a workshop. It's an invite-only workshop about once a month where I'll only invite 8 to 10 companies. It's meant to be a lot more interactive. It's primarily focused towards startups. So if you're a startup trying to learn the stuff better, just comment workshop and I'll add you to that invite list. And then cybersecurity, CyberMed is a spinoff of Boldtype. It came out of, we have very deep cybersecurity expertise on the team. So if you ever need help with cybersecurity, whether it's preparing the documentation or doing fuzz penetration testing, all of that, reach out there. Here's our contact info. For me, it's jose@boldtype.com. For Rob, it's rob@FDA-eSTAR.com. And then you saw Lindsay's contact info as well. I'm guessing Lindsay probably responds faster, Rob, or?
Yeah, she catches it every day, and I'm always behind on emails. But Lindsay, there's on our contact us page, there's actually a button you can schedule meetings with me or Lindsay. And so if you have, just schedule a meeting with one of the two of us.
Perfect.
And I would like to add that Rob is going to be joining us on MedTech Leading Voice Exchange Friday in Focus. I think we said December 5th.
Yes.
And so if you liked hearing Rob today and you want to hear more about the lead auditor program and you're not sure, that would be a great time to come and test it before you buy it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. December 5th. And that'll be after the pre-order, so you can get that nice big discount.
Yeah, so stay tuned for more links, more announcements, plenty of great stuff coming up. And also, lastly, I'd like to say if there's anybody on the call that would like a specific topic covered, please feel free to reach out to me. You know where to find me on LinkedIn, medtechleadingvoice.com. Thank you both very much today for your participation and to the entire audience for giving up an hour of their time.
Yes, thank you all. And I know David's asking for a TIR number. I think it's TIR 45 is the one you're asking about, maybe on Agile. So one last answer there before we go. But thank you all also for joining. Thank you, Rob, for joining as well.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
guys.